Korea. How did develop its economy? In the past, Japan was a rather powerless country in Asia. The forces that were pushed out of the Korean peninsula had settled on the Japanese archipelago. Japan began to grow in earnest from the 16th century, through trade with Europe. Since then, Japan has fought several invasion wars against the continent. At last, Japan takes over Korea. At the end of the 19th century, Korea had no choice but to rely on the United States. However, due to the British and Japanese alliances, the United States withdraws from Korea. 1905. And then a while later the United States began to wage war against Japan. 1941. Japan was defeated, and Korea was liberated from Japan on August 15, 1945. But Korea was not a World War II ally. So North Korea was under Soviet power, and South Korea was under US control until 1948. But at that time, the US preferred Japan over Korea. Why? The US couldn't beat Japan completely. On the other hand, Germany suffered a total defeat. The US and allies completely occupied Germany. But in the case of Japan, the US could not occupy the mainland of Japan. They occupied only Okinawa Island, and atomic bomb to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to negotiate the end of the war. The US and Japan ended the war through negotiations. In fact, Japan is an important position in the US defense. Japan and the Philippines are the western defense lines of the United States, not Korea. Therefore, South Korea was influenced by Japan through the US, even after liberation. North Korea took advantage of this, saying that South Korea is a country founded by pro-Japanese forces. It was a political instigation. However, the first Korean regime was founded by the anti-Japan colony independence group. The first South Korea president was Syngman Rhee. He traveled between United States and Hawaii, and campaigned for independence against Japan. Right after liberation of Korea, the US preferred the Korean Democratic Party rather than Syngman Rhee. The Korean Democratic Party is a pro-Japanese faction. If Korea had been built by pro-Japanese forces, it would have been unified into North Korea. Although the US hated Syngman Rhee, just left him as the first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee was not anti-American, but anti-Japanese. So friction was inevitable. He captured or fired Japanese ships operating on Dokdo Island, Korean territory. Japan wanted to establish diplomatic relations with Korea, but Syngman Rhee refused. He held the presidency for 12 years while changing the constitution. That was his weakness. Dictatorship. Korean protesters threw out Syngman Rhee, asking the dictator to step down. Syngman Rhee resigned from the presidency, taking responsibility for fraudulent elections. But it was a vice presidential election, not a presidential election. US and Japan were strongly suspected of being behind the demonstration. During the Syngman Rhee regime, Korea was poor. At that time, South Korea's income level was almost the lowest in the world. Of course, it was also because of the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. But after the war for about 10 years, there was also no industrialization. The US was giving a lot of aid to Korea, but the US only encouraged the consumer goods industry. It seems there was always Japan behind the US. After the Syngman Rhee government ends, the second government, the Menjang regime, appears. Of course, Menjang did not oppose the establishment of diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan. Menjang government seemed like a regime for diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan. But Menjang did not punish the police, firemen, during the demonstration of Syngman Rhee's resignation. During the protest against Syngman Rhee, more than 100 people were killed by police firing. Contrary to the intention of the United States, Korean people protested against Menjang. Even the soldiers who intervened in the illegal election were not fired, so most soldiers were also complaining to Menjang. At that point, a military coup occurred. May 16, 1961. It was Chung Park who led the coup. Inevitably, Commander Magruder of the U.S. forces of Korea tried to suppress the coup. But the Korean government refused to suppress the coup. The coup was successful. Right away, Chung Park's military government suffered aid cuts from the U.S. government. U.S. administration regarded Chung Park as left-winger communist. But Chung Park did not oppose the Korea-Japan agreement. He also was a Japanese soldier in World War II. He seemed to be pro-Japanese group. But US and Japan did not trust him. Because his brother Syngman Park during the Japanese colonial period, he was an independence activist. Syngman Park also was left-winger. And he was during the US military regime, 1945 to 1948, killed by police during a demonstration. Unwillingly he took off his military uniform, and ran for the presidential election. The United States wanted Yoon Bo-sun to be elected. Yoon attacked Park saying, he is a communist while campaigning for president. Park confronted him by telling him to stop McCarthyism. Park won the election by a margin of only a few 100,000 votes, with angry Southwest residents and Southeastern residents of his hometown. The Southwestern residents voted for Park, because they were unfairly suspected of being leftists in the Syngman Rhee regime, and many people died. The incident is called the Yeosu-Sun-Chen Rebellion. Anyway, he was elected president, but still he was suspected of being a communist, so he took a more pro-American stance. He sent Korean troops to U.S. Vietnam War 1964. He established diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan, 1965. At that time, the U.S. still encouraged the consumer goods industry as it did under the Syngman Rhee regime. Park administration made dollars by exporting wigs and other things to the United States. Light industrial exports. He received the money as a reward for the Korea-Japan agreement. He built large dams and highways and invested in the steel industry. At that time, the opposition parties in Korea opposed the idea, saying, there are not many cars, so why are we building highways? But he pushed the plan, saying let's think about the future. With the dispatch of the Vietnam War, he earned a loan from the United States, and earned dollars by the export of military supplies. In the early 1960s, GDP per person was around $80, but by the end of the 1960s, it increased to $220. Until then, he had a good relationship with the US and Japan. But at the end of his tenure, a national crisis comes to Korea. That was the Nixon Doctrine. Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, 1969 to 1974. At that time, protests against the Vietnam War were taking place in the United States. Nixon said the United States would no longer intervene in Asian affairs. Vietnam, Korea and Taiwan are notified of the withdrawal of U.S. forces. And Nixon visited China. For the first time in the history of the United States. Nixon told Mao Zedong that Japan would never reoccupy South Korea. But Nixon returned Okinawa to Japan. Okinawa was an independent country, not Japan. Nixon also said this when he was vice president. It was an American mistake to include disarming in the Japanese Constitution. For South Korea that was a shock. The nightmare at the end of the 19th century seemed to be reviving. President John F. even said that let's give Korea back to Japan. In this situation, Park fixes the Constitution and extends the term of office in the name of independent national defense. He declares the start of the heavy chemical industry. Heavy chemical industry equals arms industry. Of course, the US and Japan were opposed to it. So Park suppressed democracy, with a clause in the Constitution that the president could arrest without a warrant. To suppress pro-Japanese, pro-American politicians of Korea. At the time, Hyundai, a Korean automobile company, had been partnering with Ford USA. Hyundai was a company that assembled Ford's auto parts. However, as soon as the Park administration announced the localization of automobiles, Suddenly, Ford announced its breakup with Hyundai. The Korean government chose Mitsubishi Company of Japan as a partner for Korea's economic development. At that time, Mitsubishi was a company that built World War II Zero-Sen fighter jets, classified as a war criminal company, and was broken down into pieces by the U.S. Mitsubishi was distancing himself from Japanese politics. Mitsubishi joined hands with Korea to revive the company. Hyundai Motor has formed a technology partnership with Mitsubishi and started copying Mitsubishi technologies one by one. Mitsubishi did not care about the technology leak because the automobile industry was not the focus at the time. If the Korean government had chosen Toyota as its partner, it would have been separated immediately. It was the strategic choice of the Korean government. The Japanese government has banned some machines from exporting to Korea to prevent technology leakage, semiconductor device, etc. Hyundai Motor Company even made a Korean military tank with full support from the Park government. In exchange for participating in the Vietnam War, the Park government obtained a license for the M16 rifle and produced it. And he made a Korean rifle out of it. Colt, the maker of M16, also filed a plagiarism suit against the Korean government. The US and Japan didn't oppose these rifles tanks to defend North Korea. However, the problem is that Park was secretly pursuing missile and nuclear development. From the perspective of the US and Japan, Park has become the object of overthrow. So the US and Japan begin to support Kim Dae-jung, who is opposition to Park Chung-hee. Chun Doo-hwan, who will be the next president after Park Chung-hee, is actually a person who can be seen as a supporter of the United States and Japan. In 1972, Ambassador Habib was already considering Chun Doo-hwan as the next president. Park was almost assassinated on August 15, 1974. By some force. At that time, Japan suddenly tried to turn the Korea-Japan economic cooperation into an agriculture-centered business, and even tried to turn it to the private level rather than the government-to-government. Japan received Kim Dae-jung asylum and actively supported the anti-Park movement. Park did not even go abroad even once in the 1970s because of the risk of assassination. He further suppressed democracy, and he unconditionally arrested those who opposed it. In 1977, Korea achieved $10 billion in exports. And eventually, Korea succeeded in launching a surface-to-ground ballistic missile for the 7th time in the world in September 1978. The United States and Japan regarded it as a nuclear missile, and began to pressure the Park government further. Eventually, he was assassinated by a close assistant. After the regime changed to the Democratic Carter government, Kim Jae-gyu, who assassinated Park Chung-hee, testified in court that he assassinated to improve relations with the United States. After the assassination of Park Chung-hee, Korean politics was in chaos. Chun Doo-hwan overturned Park Chung-hee soldiers and took power through a coup. U.S. forces of Korea condoned Chun Doo-hwan's coup. As expected, Chun Doo-hwan abandoned South Korea's nuclear missile. And he got the U.S. automobile export market and '88 Olympic bid as a price. During the Park era, Hyundai Motor Company exported to the Middle East and South America, couldn't export to the United States. But in Chun Doo-hwan's era, 150,000 units of Hyundai Excel were sold in the U.S. in 1986, and 260,000 units were sold in 1987. It was impossible without the help of the U.S. government, for a minor automaker to achieve such results in the U.S. market. Of course, there's a joke that Americans couldn't distinguish between Hyundai and Honda. Chun Doo-hwan also earned $4 billion in loans and semiconductor equipment from Japan, in exchange for missile abandonment. Korea's Samsung Semiconductor started to grow significantly since then. In sum, the development of the Korean economy was the result of the Nixon administration's operation to neglect Korea, in addition to the strong will for self-reliance and independent national defense spirit in the rapidly changing international situation, such as détente in the early 1970s. There's no assumption in history. But if it was the democratic government in the early 1970s, Korean heavy industry would have failed. because the Democratic Party had close ties with Japan. The Republican Party approved the reunification of Germany despite British opposition. Japan's original plan was to make Korea an economic subjugation relationship, like Indonesia. But Park Chung-hee apprehended Japan's intentions, and copied the Japanese industry, and pushed for localization. For the Korean president, basically, visiting the US and Japan was a mandatory event. But he never visited Japan as president even once. However, Park Chung-hee is being criticized by Koreans as a dictator and pro-Japanese group. Because his opponents continued to take power. Because history is written by the victor.